Right. Well, thank you. And kia ora, everyone. Kia ora koutou. I'm Ko Victoria McLennan Takawangawa. Please call me Vic. And welcome to this ITP webinar called a Fireside Chat. And I'm here today with Stephen Judd, who's the president of Internet New Zealand. Welcome, Stephen.
Yeah, kia ora, Vic. Thanks for the welcome. Hi, everyone. Great to be here.
Yeah, it's lovely to have you here. Now, this is webinar style, everybody. We are recording it, and if you want to ask a question of Stephen, just use the Q&A function, and I'll relay those during the session. We'll go for about 45 minutes, and I've got a few questions I'm going to ask first, but I'm sure you've all got questions as well. To kick us off, though, Stephen, do you want to tell us a little bit about you and your potted history, who you are and what you do before we start talking about
Yeah,
Internet New Zealand things?
sure. Well, I guess the first thing is I am the president of InternetNZ, which got me a lot of gentle, good-natured stuff when I got elected, because like, hey, you're the president now. But president is a pretty glam title, but really it's just being the chair of a mostly elected board of an incorporated society. I do not command anything or anyone. I mean, personally, I've been working with the internet and software development for about as long as there has been an internet. So my first encounters were at the console of I had a terminal connected to a VMS mini computer at the University of Waikato sometime in the early 90s. And I've done lots of things in our interest in our industry, from being working on the help desk to being a developer to being on the executive leadership team of my last job. But I'm pretty lucky to be semi-retired at this stage, and so I'm focusing a lot more on community-orientated stuff, which I guess Internet NZ's one. Teaching capoeira which is a kind of Brazilian martial art that's very community focused, is another one. Working with Aotearoa and a few other little sidelines.
Sounds good. Thanks for that. Good to learn a bit about you and your diversity of what you're doing, and be
Yeah.
envious of your semi-retirement. Um, so next we should get your perspective on Internet New Zealand as an organisation. Why does Internet New Zealand exist, and what is its scope of mahi?
Yeah, why do we exist? One of my predecessors used to refer to our operation of the .nz registry as our sacred trust, because he considered it that important. I do too, and so do a lot of our members. So when I say, just for people who aren't clear what the registry is, there's really two things here. One is making sure that when you do a DNS lookup of a .nz name, it works. But also we're effectively operating a wholesale market in names, which means that through our subsidiary, which is the Domain Name Commission, we are the regulator of that market. And that's really, really important, just the good operation of .nz. Part of having the operation of .nz delegated to us by our upstream partners overseas is that we do internet governance work. So there's a lot that happens internationally between registries with ICANN and IANA and a whole soup of acronyms out there, which are the international agencies that together define the rules and protocols through which the internet operates. Another big thing that we do is that we advocate and we educate in the internet community through our policy and our charity work. Internet community is actually a really interesting phrase, because like back in the day, like 30 years ago, those were the people who cared about the nascent internet, right? So researchers, far-sighted entrepreneurs, great big nerds. But now it's potentially everybody with a smartphone. So that's changed over time. But so just to talk about that kind of charitable and advocacy work, I mean, that ranges from working with Red Cross on digital equity and supporting new migrants having internet access in New Zealand, to really old school stuff like working with the New Zealand Network Operators Group, which is a peak body for people in networking in New Zealand. We do an annual survey of internet users across the country, which is really interesting. So we're tracking people's attitudes, their level of access, what they're concerned about, So we can see that in the last year, there's been a growing concern about artificial intelligence and its use in New Zealand, for example. And another really fun thing, and useful thing that we do, which I like, is the broadband map. So if you look for broadbandmap.nz, that's a way to go, what's available at my address and how good is it, and actually see what all the options are where you live. So, I mean, I hope that gives you a sense of scope. That's kind of the space that we're playing in.
So to help us kind of step into this, what's going on at the moment, I'm sitting here, IT professionals, we're a membership organisation like you, and we are undertaking constitutional reform so that we can retain compliance with the Incorporated Societies Act, and we want to modernise our constitution. What were the drivers behind Internet New Zealand undertaking the constitutional reform that you're in the middle of now?
Yeah. Well, so, I mean, just like you and just like every other incorporated society, we must have a compliant constitution in place by the middle of next year, or very bad things happen. And our constitution, as it is 30 years old and very far from being compliant. And there's a few other problems that come from it being 30 years old. One is that it's just simply outdated, kind of thinking about that change in what internet community means that I just talked about. And unfortunately, it's been amended piecemeal over time and is quite contradictory in places, which continues to cause headaches. So that's a good reason. Another one is that we do need high quality governance, and what people think good governance looks like has changed in the last 30 years. I think we all think differently now about what a good board looks like in terms of its composition. And we are running critical infrastructure. So we need governance that is appropriate for that. And, in 2018, we made a commitment to be a treaty-centric organisation. And we're honouring that commitment, and doing that as part of our constitutional review was a suggestion in the strategic racism report that we adopted several years back. So that's also part of what's going on.
Yeah, complex times, isn't it? And there are so many not-for-profits in this space right now.
Yeah, and everyone from tennis clubs to us to you is doing it with greater and lesser degrees of controversy in the process.
So let's talk a bit about the controversy. The first question, I guess, is we've all heard that there's been an influx of new members to Internet New Zealand. Can you tell us how many?
So no, actually. I mean, I will give you an indicator in a moment, but actually it's just I haven't seen today's figures. The last that I saw was sometime on Friday.
Oh, good.
So I think on Friday we were looking at about 2,100, and therefore I'd expect several hundreds north of 2,000 would be the answer by now. I can't confirm that, but I'd be really surprised if it wasn't. And to kind of contextualize that, we started out with, I think, around 360 on that order. So yeah, it's a pretty big increase.
It's a big change.
Yeah, over about a 3-week period.
Yeah. So we'll talk a bit more about that as we go through this. I just wanted to touch first on public trust. And public trust in Internet New Zealand is built on its reputation for independence and technical expertise. With the organisation under such intense scrutiny, how do you balance transparency and member engagement while still ensuring that the critical infrastructure decisions remain in the hands of those who are best equipped to make them?
Yeah, good question. And I think actually when you say critical infrastructure decisions, one of the things that people are concerned about now is the administration of .nz names as part of that, which is why the first thing I'll probably point out is the Domain Name Commission. So the Domain Name Commission is a separate entity. It is wholly owned by us, but it's got separate governance. And so what that means is there is no direct linkage between me and my council and what the DNC does. It's an independent regulator. And the DNC is the body that looks after and applies the rules by which .nz operates. And, kind of to clarify what I mean by the rules, what I mean is rules like to have a .govt.nz name, you must be a public agency connected with the New Zealand government. There are rules about how your interaction, if you license a name, with the registrar who sold you that license. There are just, there's a ton of rules that are just about the operation of that marketplace. And those rules only get changed after a pretty extensive public consultation process that we have committed to. So to give you an example of that, a few years ago, we made it possible for you to register a name directly in .nz. So instead of having mclennan.co.nz or mclennan.net.nz or whatever, you could just have mclennan.nz at the top of the tree and easier to type and whatever. But there was a little problem with that, which is that if you had got mclennan.co.nz and someone else had mclennan.net.nz, who was going to get mclennan.nz? That kind of situation is what we call conflicted names. And when we made that change, which itself was heavily consulted, there was a process for people to try and resolve the disputes. It's been many years now, and there's a minority but still reasonable number of names that resolution hasn't taken place, and we need a way to kind of streamline the administration of conflicted names, etc. So anyway, it's taken us about 18 months of consultation, rounds of public consultation, back and forth, etc., 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 to finally get to the point where InternetNZ's been able to adopt a policy. So I think, getting to ensuring that decisions remain in the hands of those best equipped to make them, like the regulatory decisions are with a regulator, and the rules are in the hands of all the stakeholders, frankly. So that's one big part of it. As far as transparency goes, we're a really transparent organisation compared to most NGOs and businesses. So if you're a member, you can just dial in and audit a council meeting. All our papers are online, that go to the council, as well as the minutes, and they're only confidential if they're commercially sensitive or there's advice in them or that kind of thing. And we generally publish those once they're no longer sensitive, or we apply the most minimal redaction that we can. So, and most of them are on our website as well. So even if you're not a member, you can still find all that stuff out. I mean, I think that's a degree of transparency that's actually quite rare. And I guess lastly, we are an incorporated society, right? So we're member-based, and that means that in effect members own the organisation, but they don't direct day-to-day operation. They elect a governance layer, which is the InternetNZ Council, and that's where their influence lies. They don't get to march into the office and demand to be taken to the big red switch. That's not how it works.
Yeah, and that was a great answer, and it probably answers the next three questions I was going to ask you.
But no, let's do it.
I'll ask them slightly differently.
Yeah.
This constitutional reform process and the influx of new members has highlighted concerns about external groups reshaping Internet New Zealand in your direction. So when you've got politically motivated groups like that involved, what safeguards are in place and what can you do to ensure that the organisation can still stick to its core mission?
Yeah, I think there's a couple of things I'll point to. Well, several things. One is I'll just revert back to that earlier mention of DNC, that our structure provides some safeguards there directly. Another thing, very basic thing, which a lot of incorporated societies have, is very simple, that you don't get all the rights of a member straight away, including voting rights. And you might think that's just kind of a stalling tactic. But actually, one of the important consequences of that is people get a little time to settle in and look around and talk to some existing members and read all the papers that they're presented with and maybe go, oh, this is not what I thought it was. So I do actually think or I certainly hope that that stand down period is going to have some kind of effect there when people make their own assessment of what they're seeing. And I think a third thing that's really worth bearing in mind is that both our current constitution and the one that we aim to pass shortly have objects. And the objects of a charitable society really outline the limits within which it operates. So your political motivation might be whatever, but what you do in governance is still going to be limited by our objects, which are, not really very well suited to pursuing any particular political agenda, which is what you would hope.
Mm.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, good answer. So then thinking about you as that kind of neutral steward of the New Zealand internet infrastructure, as you've just described, and how well protected it is, there are going to be diverse views now within the membership. So there are going to be people from both ends of those kind of ideological spectrums. How are you going to foster open debate and garnering all of those views without kind of becoming a battleground for conflicts?
Well, I mean, one way is actually representative democracy. So we have a council, people can run for council, and a representative body actually is often a better way to have those kinds of debates, because once you're in governance, you have to work with the other governors for the good of the society. That's your legal obligation under the Incorporated Societies Act, is to do what's in the best interests of the society. So that, the debate often is likely to take place in the context of electing the governors. Beyond that, as I mentioned, the objects in our constitution are there. That's what people in the governance layer will have to have regard for. But I mean, it is right that we need to foster open debate. So right now, we have a thing called NetHub, which is essentially a dedicated set of Slack channels where members can talk to each other. We will, in due course, hopefully in the next few weeks, can't promise because the team that's doing it is actually paradoxically under the pump with all the new members. But we hope soon to bring back the famous email lists in a different and more manageable form. And hopefully when people get to talk to each other, they will actually find that the best interests of the community are not that hard to agree on. We'll see.
Well, it kind of leads to me asking you a slightly in-your-face question, I guess, and that is that I was once an Internet New Zealand member, and I left in that great exodus of, I think it was about 2022, as a result of some inappropriate, unchecked behaviour by members on the message boards. So I know you've changed a lot of things. You had the systemic racism review, you've moved the messaging system to NetHub, as you've described, and you've got moderation functions. But I guess my question, selfishly, and for anyone listening, if I was to rejoin now, will I be safe online in that Internet New Zealand environment?
Yeah, I mean, the first thing I should say is to acknowledge your experience there, which you're by no means alone in feeling that way and having that experience. So yeah, as you said, moderation is really important. So we will have, I think we currently, as of today, do have professional moderation in that space. I think it's my personal belief that good moderation is a highly underrated but really sophisticated skill that needs to be done by people who are qualified to do it. And we do have that in a revised code of conduct that hopefully the combination of those things will make it a better space to be in. I can't promise that every person in that space will behave well, but there will be consequences if they don't.
And having that moderation and consequences makes such a huge, powerful difference, doesn't it?
That's right. And I think it's also important to say that when a private organisation provides a space, it can set the rules for that space. There is nothing stopping people organising their own spaces with different rules if they don't like it. And they can and they should. And so, yeah.
Thank you. Good answer. Sorry, slightly contemptuous question.
No,
Confronting question.
let's go there.
Well, so I'm going to just remind everyone who's listening to this as we are clocking through the time. If you do have questions for Stephen, please pop them on the Q&A. There you go. He's up for the contentious questions, so feel free. I'm just going to change direction slightly.
Yeah.
So you haven't been president for very long, and I'll bet you weren't expecting any of this when you stepped into this role. So when you stood for president, what were your aspirations for the organisation?
Right. So, I mean, sorry, pardon the hysterical laughter. It has been quite a surprise the last 3 or 4 weeks. So yeah, I wasn't expecting this. In fact, when I was running, I was thinking, well, my predecessor, Joy Littlecoach, he had worked very hard to deal with a series of challenges, none of them of her making, like dealing with the effects of the pandemic, with that implementing the hard work of implementing the results of the strategic racism review, with a technical hiccup that we had last year that needed a lot of work to investigate to make sure that we didn't do that again. And I was thinking, well, lucky old me, I've got clear air from here. That's going to be good. Thanks, Joy. You've left things in a really good space. So yeah, but that aside, when our election campaign was taking place mid last year, a theme that I heard again and again from members, but also just kind of people in our orbit, maybe former members or people who are like, yeah, I know, but why would I join? Was InternetNZ's become very inward looking, very inward focused. Where are you people? Why aren't you out in the world like you used to be? And I think, to be fair, some of the things that we had to deal with, which sort of goes to what I said Joy had to do, did necessitate being somewhat inward focused. I think there are real reasons for that perception, but also that perception is what it was, is what it is, was what it was. English is hard. But anyway, I said at the time, and I wanted at the time, that we should get better at involving our members again and telling our story. Some people are like, oh, it's best not to be in the news because when you're in the news, it's because you did something wrong. But we actually do need to be out there, and that is part of maintaining our social license. We are an NGO doing something that a lot of people wonder why the government doesn't do it. Our part of our legitimacy does come from having an engaged set of members and going, well, yeah, we actually represent some people. So that is why I wanted to bring back some form of member-to-member communication that's not Slack. I mean, some people love it. I personally don't, but I think, a range of forums is appropriate. And running more events that actually get us out there engaging with people and being more visible. And yeah, actually one of my aspirations was getting a new constitution in, because I knew it was important. It's something that we actually have to do and get across the line. So those are the things I was thinking about. Yeah.
And as a result of what's happened in the last 3 weeks with this influx of different members that you weren't expecting, does that change what you think your plans for the rest of your tenure will be?
I think if anything, it's accelerated them. I mean, honestly, it feels like a very classic case of be careful what you wish for. Because I did wish for member engagement. Our poor staff will tell you that I and the council have been quite hard on that in the last few months. And we've certainly got a lot of member engagement, and we will, right? Because we've got a much bigger membership. A lot of people will have joined up because of the Free Speech Union's campaign, and a lot of people will have joined up for other reasons. So I think it will likely be quite a broad-based membership. And in the best case, that could actually work out really well. And likewise, we're probably going to have to, in serving that membership and serving the wider community, do more to create spaces where they can meet each other in a way that's productive. And again, that's you asked earlier about how to get dialogue going when there's conflict, and actually creating spaces where people can talk to each other without yelling at each other is going to be really crucial in that. So whether that's achievable, we will have to see, but that is something that I very much want to see.
Yeah, and when you reflect back, as you said, you've been in this working in this internet space for a long time, and looking back at what Internet New Zealand's done in the past, it hasn't all been doom and gloom, has it? There are things that I'm sure you've reflected on that you've thought Internet New Zealand did this really well, or New Zealand punched above their weight globally, or
Yeah,
things that you can be proud of.
yeah, sure. I mean, like taking that very long view, um, we have been doing what we do from a time when most people just didn't realize it was important, didn't think it was going to be important, or just didn't even know what it was, right up until the present day, where we are running this slice of critical infrastructure for everybody in Aotearoa, and we are succeeding at that. And that in itself is something to be really proud of. But just to give you an example of something international where New Zealand is, through InternetNZ, through Ipurangi Aotearoa, is doing something really good, I think. The current model for internet governance, and which has been for decades, is a thing called the multi-stakeholder model. And in the multi-stakeholder model, academic researchers, businesses, community groups, individuals, governments, whatever, are all participating in the internet governance process, and they all have a voice, and that creates outcomes that are very robust and that have a good, solid mandate, and have given us the interoperable open internet that we prize. But right now, there is that debate's been reopened, and there are moves afoot through the UN to adopt a different kind of model that would be government-led, nation-state-led, more along the lines of how the postal union works. And the thing is that more autocratic states, more autocratic governments really love that model, because it puts governments unambiguously in charge, and that creates a pathway to kind of control their local internet much more, and stop that kind of open thing, that element that we think is really so critical. And InternetNZ is at the forefront of organising support to preserve the multi-stakeholder model, along with other registries in other countries. But we are leading the charge on that. I mean, and ironically, this is very much a freedom of speech issue, among other things. I'll just want to point out. But to kind of like then having zoomed out in time and in space, to kind of get right back to really local level. In this country, I'm actually really proud of how in the last few years we've responded to the challenge of serving that broader internet community, the Māori community, other communities, and not just the traditional kind of techie business old boys club that might have been our natural home at some point, but we need to grow out of that. And I think we have been doing that, and that's a good thing. And not every organisation is good at that kind of growth, but can organisations have personal growth?
Yeah, I think they have. And I think that consensus building and recognizing that there are different communities who are hard to reach, who don't necessarily understand that they need to be part of this conversation, is quite challenging. So I think that's a good thing to be proud of, that evolution of the organisation. It's great. I do have a question from James on the message board, who's the parent of a 6-year-old,
Yeah.
and he's saying he thinks that when he asks schools about acceptable conflict, he doesn't get clear answers from them. And he thinks that you didn't sign up to needing to be a theorist in acceptable conflict. It's obviously not what you thought you were going to be doing.
Dang
Is this
straight.
something that the wider organisation is working on?
Yeah, that's right. I mean, obviously, it's not me that's defining that. That is our community engagement staff and that moderation team and so forth. But I think actually, as with a lot of things, while the exact contours are hard to delineate, it's actually quite easy to point out some extremes that are not okay. Like your 6-year-old's not allowed to punch and bite other 6-year-olds.
Mm.
I think we all agree that's off the table. And I think likewise, we can think of some things in how people behaving respectfully to each other ought to behave that are not controversial.
And agree to what the ground rules are for a group of people interacting, right?
That's right. Again, I come back to private organisations can define their own rules. And there's nothing wrong with that, and there's nothing unusual about that. Parliament has rules about what is parliamentary language for
And
very
we
good
watch them
reason.
played out in interesting ways every day,
Yeah,
don't
actually,
we?
maybe that's not the best example. I can't say that Parliament is a super flexible institution, but yeah, you get my drift.
I'm going to go there on a completely different note, and that is the multinational or the large platform
Yeah.
players, the Facebooks, Googles, TikToks, whoever of this world. They're a double-edged sword here for us in such a small country of New
Mm,
Zealand, aren't they? And Internet New Zealand at different times over the ages. I remember in the times when I was a member would go from being quite polarizingly wanting more controls over those platforms to accepting that they're a harsh reality that we have to live with. Is
mm.
that something that's going to be on the agenda for discussion in the near future again?
Yeah, I think it always will be. In fact, if you were to dive into that NetHub service that I mentioned earlier, there's a pretty lively debate going on there right now, or yesterday anyway, about this precise issue, about that conflict between what government's power to regulate and the practical limits of jurisdiction. So that's going to, as we learn more about what we might call the externalities or the side effects of big platforms models, which prize engagement above everything else, and that depend on pretty light-handed moderation. How did I start that sentence? As those effects continue to manifest, we're going to continue to debate what the appropriate response is. And it may well be that the appropriate response is not regulation per se, but more about how we equip people to handle that. I don't mean that in a victim blamey kind of way, but personally, for example, when I think about misinformation and disinformation, where my mind goes is not some kind of ministry of truth, but actually more about media literacy and critical thinking, so that people are better equipped to kind of penetrate persuasive techniques and understand what's happening. And likewise, also you've got to bear in mind, I am merely the president. I know that sounds weird, but I come back to, I don't direct what the policy team comes up with. I might, the council might say we're interested in this area, but we don't tell them, and this is what you're going to write, because we hire people to be experts in policy development.
Yeah.
Sorry, rambling a bit.
And Kay has echoed that by saying, not a question, but thanks to Internet New Zealand for funding development of a guide for social media group moderation. and she's put a link to that, which I'll put that link in the follow-up. Were you
Thank
involved
you,
in
Kay.
that?
It is embarrassing for me not to have just dropped that in there. In my defence, I can't be across everything that we do, but yes.
Well, there you go. Here's Kay endorsing this
Yeah,
moderation guide, so that's really,
yeah.
really good. So I'm conscious that we haven't had many more questions and we're running out of time. Is there any sort of last things that we didn't cover in the what's happening in Internet New Zealand at the moment with the constitutional reform and the influx of members that you'd like to talk about?
Um, yeah, I think I'll just say that it's a process that's been running for a long time, and we've done our best to make that public and make that accessible to our members. And it's a process that was running pretty nicely um, towards a conclusion when we sent out our drafting guidelines for people to get feedback on. And so it has been a bit of a distraction to have to deal with people reacting to that proposal rather than providing feedback or waiting to see the actual text that would be voted on. I read this morning in the Herald that David Harvey is somewhat mollified, in fact, by the text as he's seen it now, which is great. But it does kind of highlight how this has been kind of a pretty unnecessary distraction. It'll be good if we grow our membership and with lots of people who care about it and they have that diversity of views. So you know there is a nice story that can still come out of this, and I kind of hope that is where it lands.
And it kind of solidifies, there's been an age-old question, I know from years ago, should Internet New Zealand be a membership organisation or not? And this is forcing that conversation, isn't
Yeah.
it? And solidifying that thinking.
Well, I think there's a really important reason for it to be a membership organisation. There are two reasons actually. One is that in the best case, membership does actually act as a conscience in a way that a kind of self-appointing body of governors never would. And you know, that is why we have that open democratic structure, right? You might not like how it plays out, but that's why we've got it. But the other thing I would say is that you know, when there are big debates about policy, there's government and the public sector. You know, the government of the day plus the you know public servants, and there's people with business interests. But there are not many agencies that represent users and people at large. And if we stay in touch with our community, that's actually a really important role for us, and that's a reason to be an incorporated society rather than government or some very narrow body like we. That goes to your earlier question about what's our reason to live.
I think that's a great place to end on. I really appreciate your time today. This was a good conversation. I hope for everyone who's been listening, they've found it valuable as well. Um, I'm sure people will be able to figure out how to get hold of you if they have follow-up questions or if this has inspired them to join
Yeah, well, I am literally
Internet.
president at internetnz.net.nz, or there's like
Yeah.
the email address is actually on the website. So yeah, definitely.
Look, now that I'm signing off, people are popping questions up. So I'll just quickly ask you a couple. What does the membership fee fund? Is it your only source of funds? That's a great question.
It actually surprisingly, in a sense, doesn't fund it. It doesn't quite cover the cost of administration. Again, very hilarious in the great influx of members that we've just had, where we've had to do a lot of work to cope with it, that those fees don't cover. Our main source of income is the fee that we charge registrars when you register a name. So when you register yourname.nz, we get a bit of money. And as a charity, we then disperse monies as appropriate once we've made sure that the whole operation is well funded.
Great way of answering that question. The next question is from Mark, who has asked about how well do the membership organisations working on New Zealand tech issues such is this collaborate, meaning Internet New Zealand, IT professionals, NZ Tech, NextSafe, TCS, and of course others. I answer from my perspective. I talk to Internet New Zealand team members, particularly Rose's team, Public Impact. We meet every week, so we're very ingrained in each other's lives, and often TUANZ, as the Technology Users Association, is also involved in those. So once a fortnight we have TUANZ as well. And certainly the TCF in the background quite significantly. So there's some good collaboration with some parts of that puzzle. What about from your perspective?
Yeah, I was just going to say, when you mentioned TUANZ, actually they're a grant recipient of ours among many other grant recipients, and NZNOG's another example, who are very much an industry body in the space. But one of the things that I've been doing with our CE over the last few months is meeting with our peers in exactly those organisations that you've just named, like NZ Tech and NetSafe. And historically we've collaborated where we've got things in common, and I think it's actually really important to be able to do that. That when things happen that affect the whole sector, when we can speak with one voice, that's good, and we should. And to make that happen, we need to have those kinds of ties in place. Yeah.
Yeah. I used to draw pictures for ministers because they wanted to know how we all worked and fitted together and who did what and where the overlaps were. And not so much this government, and not as interesting, but interested, but certainly the previous national government and the Labor government were very interested in how the industry kind of moves together and where our common interests were, which was great. Yeah. Last question before we go. Emma is asking, are there similar organisations in other countries that are run in the same way?
Yeah, really good question. Yes, but not all of them is the answer. So, for example, in Australia, there's AUDA, which is broadly similar in that it's a not-for-profit, but they are structured in a slightly different way. Their governance has, I think, half appointed directors or board members rather than the small minority that our council does. So they're somewhat less membership based. And actually in the way they're set up, if you register a domain name, you have the option to join. So they have a much larger membership, but a much more inactive one. And so there are some other countries that also have that kind of approach. And there are others where it's effectively a government agency that does it. It just depends. I think one of the things to think about is that because New Zealand is what it is, which is a country that's surprisingly technologically advanced for such a small country, we were there right at the very beginning, and government didn't recognise it, but some very smart people did, and they formed this society. And so we've been here doing that long before it was really on government's radar. In other countries that have been later to the internet, let's say, it's been much more obvious to them that, well, of course government would do that. But we're not like that. And yeah, so I hope that explains it. Like, yeah, no, we're not unique, but there are a lot of different models out there.
And it's always good when the community can create a movement despite government, and government later on, when they realise this is important, have somewhere to turn for advice and insight. So I think that it's a good model in that regard.
Yeah, we have a certain flexibility that the public sector doesn't normally get to exercise, for sure.
Definitely. Hey, well, thank you, Stephen, for your time. Thank you for everyone who's joined us and has listened. Hope this has answered some of your questions about what's going on with Internet New Zealand, and we'll all be watching to see how this plays out, and good luck with your constitution reform.
Great. Thank you very much.
Thanks. Ka kite.